28th of January 2023. 1:20 a.m. Walsall town centre was almost empty. Market stalls stood silent in the cold night air. A car rolled past, its headlights cutting through the dark, while another followed close behind. Inside, the men sat in silence, each knowing what was about to unfold. In moments like this, everything is set in motion, one act sparking another. A chain of events that would spiral far beyond that night. This is the story of Bailey Atkinson and Connor Brooks, and how one killing set off a cycle of revenge that would claim more lives. Bailey Atkinson, just 21, was walking through Walsall's market area. He wasn't alone. A female friend walked beside him as they made their way through the quiet high street. He was known as kind-hearted, someone who would do anything for the people close to him. But his past lingered. Bailey had moved to Walsall from Coventry 2 years earlier, hoping to escape a gang lifestyle that had already claimed too many lives around him. Police would later confirm there were tensions, old disputes that hadn't been forgotten. In Walsall, Bailey tried to carve out a different life. He spent time with friends, stayed close to his family, and kept to familiar places. On the night of 28th January 2023, he was simply out with a friend. Nothing unusual, just another quiet weekend evening. What he didn't know was that others had decided his fate long before that night began. They were barely out of their teenage years. Some were still under 18. But together they formed a pack that moved with the kind of violence that looked practiced and calculated. 7 young men, armed with blades and intent, had one target: Bailey Atkinson. The group came from Walsall and Bloxwich. Patrick Brooks, 18, of Hunter Crescent, was described as one of the core instigators. Ronan McCulloch, 19, from Livingston Road, and Sonny Loveridge, 20, of Irvine Road, were equally involved. Older members of the group who helped coordinate the attack. Benjamin Wilkes, 18, of Guild Avenue, had joined them, as had 3 younger boys, all 17, who cannot be named for legal reasons. Each of them played a part, whether behind the wheel or carrying weapons. The plan began days earlier with the theft of 2 cars, a Black Seat Leon and a Toyota Verso. They were not random vehicles. They were chosen for speed and anonymity, stripped of any identifiable links. Witnesses and CCTV would later show the killers meeting up in a supermarket car park, preparing for what was to come. According to police, this was not a spontaneous act of street violence. The killers were fueled by revenge, linked to an ongoing feud that had already cast a shadow over Walsall. They drove out that night not just to confront Bailey, but to trap him. From the driver to the passengers in the back, the killers had one goal: to corner him. They were young men, but their approach carried the ruthless efficiency of something much older, a cycle of violence they had already stepped too far into. As we discussed earlier, in the early hours of 28th January 2023, Bailey Atkinson found himself hunted through the quiet streets of Walsall town centre. CCTV later revealed how they turned, slowed, and manoeuvred with precision, ensuring Bailey had nowhere left to run. As he walked with a female friend near the market stalls, the cars closed in. One swerved directly towards them, forcing Bailey to bolt while his friend ran in the opposite direction. In those desperate seconds, he was just a young man trying to outrun death, sprinting down the high street past shuttered shops, but the chase was relentless. The Seat Leon cornered him outside Poundland. One of the attackers stepped out. Bailey ran again, back towards the market stalls, clinging to a lamppost for balance as the car charged at him once more. Within moments he was on the ground. The 7 young men swarmed, surrounding him like a pack. The final moments were captured on chilling CCTV. Bailey stumbled, collapsing to the ground as the attackers struck again and again. When the violence stopped, he was left lying on the pavement, blood pooling beneath him. The gang didn't look back. They fled to the waiting cars, vanishing into the night as quickly as they had arrived. Witnesses from a nearby Asda, stepping outside for a break, saw part of the scene. They later told police how the assailants rained blows on Bailey, one of the weapons, a 24-centimeter Rambo knife. But the damage was catastrophic. Bailey's body had more than 30 stab wounds, deep cuts to his back, arms and legs, some puncturing vital organs. He was rushed to Queen Elizabeth Hospital, Birmingham, but at 2:55 a.m., he was pronounced dead. His last words, according to police, were simple and devastating. "I'm going to die. Tell my mum I love her." A post-mortem would later reveal 65 separate injuries, wounds that told the story of a coordinated assault. In the days after the attack on Bailey Atkinson High Street, the very place where he had been chased and cut down, transformed into a site of mourning. Flowers piled high against shop fronts. Cards, candles and photos of Bailey covered the pavement. Friends and strangers stood in silence, trying to make sense of the brutality that had unfolded. Bailey's family released a statement through West Midlands Police, describing him as our kind-hearted and much-loved son, brother and grandson. Bailey was so loved by so many and will be missed so much. Their words carried the weight of grief that had no easy expression. For them, Bailey was not a victim of gang violence or street feuds. He was a young man who had been trying to build a different life, only to have it stolen from him. Tributes flooded social media. Friends described him as a beautiful boy and one of a kind, recalling his kindness and loyalty. One wrote that they couldn't get their head around the loss, while another remembered him as someone who always gave his love back in equal measure. A GoFundMe page was quickly set up to raise money for his funeral, surpassing £700 within days as the community rallied to give him a proper farewell. Police increased their presence in Walsall, patrolling the streets. Senior officers spoke publicly, urging residents to come forward with any information. The killing of Bailey Atkinson triggered one of the complex manhunts West Midlands Police had conducted in recent years. The level of violence shocked even seasoned investigators. It wasn't just a stabbing, it was a coordinated ambush carried out with precision and brutality. The attackers had come prepared, armed with multiple weapons and determined to leave no trace behind. Within minutes of the killing, the cars used in the attack were found burned out on grassland near Slater Street and Guff Street, their flames lighting up the night sky. From that point, the focus shifted to identifying those inside the cars. CCTV was gathered from across Walsall town centre, showing the whole scene, how it happened piece by piece. Detectives pieced together the killer's movements by retracing the stolen car's routes from their ignition point to the scene of the attack. CCTV footage became one of the most vital breakthroughs. Cameras around Walsall town centre captured not only the pursuit, but the critical moments when suspects climbed out of the car, preparing to strike. In some frames, their faces were clearly visible, caught in the glare of nearby security cameras. Evidence impossible to deny. Mobile phone analysis backed up these visuals. Investigators mapped out the suspects' phones, confirming they had met earlier that night in a supermarket car park before heading into Walsall. It was a coordinated hunt, and every piece of digital data helped tie the group together, step by step, as they stalked Bailey. In the weeks that followed, early morning raids across Walsall, Bloxwich and Marston Green led to a string of arrests. Patrick Brooks, Ronan McCulloch, Sonny Loveridge and Benjamin Wilkes were all taken into custody. 3 17-year-old boys were also arrested. Envar Witter, 18, and a 16-year-old boy from Walsall were also detained, though both were later cleared of all charges. Detective Inspector Jim Mahon described the case as one of the most complex his team had faced. It relied on a blend of CCTV, phone data, forensic evidence and witness statements, including accounts from staff at a nearby Asda who had rushed to Bailey's aid. Police later confirmed the group's motive was revenge for an earlier assault involving a relative of one of the attackers, a feud that had been brewing for months, but reports have not confirmed any specific names. I've checked multiple sources and nothing solid has been found. If any locals have key knowledge about this, feel free to share it with us. On 24th May 2024, Nottingham Crown Court delivered its verdict on one of Walsall's most brutal killings. 7 young men stood in the dock, each convicted of the murder of Bailey Atkinson. They faced charges of murder carried out in revenge. During the trial, prosecutors presented damning evidence, mobile phone data, CCTV tracking, and forensic evidence, proving that this was no random act of violence but a deliberate hunt. The prosecution highlighted how the gang operated like a pack, passing weapons between them, ensuring Bailey had no chance to escape. The defendants denied involvement, but the jury found them guilty after reviewing overwhelming evidence. The court described the attack as a brutal, coordinated assault, leaving Bailey with no chance to survive. But even as the judge condemned their actions, the violence did not end with Bailey's killers behind bars. Their conviction would ignite a new cycle of bloodshed, a chain of retaliation that would claim another life just months later. We will come to this revenge attack shortly, so make sure you stick around. Judge Michael Chambers. Casey condemned the brutality of the attack, describing it as a ruthless and cowardly act of violence where the victim was hunted down and given no opportunity to defend himself. Patrick Brooks, 18, of Hunter Crescent, Walsall, was detained for life with a minimum term of 20 years. Ronan McCulloch, 19, of Livingstone Road, Bloxwich, received a life sentence with a minimum term of 20 years. Sonny Loveridge, 20, of Irvine Road, Bloxwich, was given a life sentence with a minimum term of 23 years, the longest of the group due to his leading role in coordinating the attack. Benjamin Wilkes, 18, of Guild Avenue, Bloxwich, was sentenced to life with a minimum term of 18 years. 3 17-year-old boys, 2 from Walsall and 1 from Marston Green, were each detained for life with minimum terms of 19 years. The conviction of Bailey Atkinson's killers did not bring closure. It fanned the flames of anger. Among Bailey's friends, talk of retaliation was already in motion, a determination to avenge his death and strike back at those connected to the Brooks family. Reports later confirmed that the revenge was carefully plotted. Bailey's friends weren't acting on impulse, they were planning a statement of violence. They scouted vehicles, settling on a stolen black Ford Focus. It wasn't chosen at random. The car would become the weapon's delivery, fitted with false plates and stripped of anything that could lead back to them. Behind this plan were 3 key figures: Jake Sambrook, Byron Selleck, and Julian Falconer, all young men with close ties to Bailey. Each of them knew the weight of what they were about to do. Alongside them was Samuel Danks Petty, whose job would be to make sure nothing was left behind. No car, no trace, no evidence that could tie them to the revenge attack. On the afternoon of 8th of July 2023, violence returned to Walsall. It was just before 5 p.m. when Connor Brooks and his friend Bradley Sladison parked up in a van on Well Lane, Blakenall Heath. Families were nearby, children were leaving school. The street was alive with the usual summer bustle until the black Ford Focus appeared. This was the same stolen Focus that Bailey Atkinson's friends had prepared for weeks. It rolled slowly past the van. Just 6 seconds later, a passenger window slid down. A shotgun was raised. A single blast shattered the quiet. The shot tore through the driver's side, striking Connor in the head. Bradley, in the passenger seat, felt the impact on his left shoulder as he ducked. He would survive, but Connor slumped against the window, his life ending before help could arrive. Witnesses described scenes of chaos as parents pulled children away from the area, unsure if more shots would follow. The attackers didn't stop. The Focus accelerated and fled the scene within seconds. Just minutes later, it was driven to Worley Lane, where the murder weapon, a double-barreled sawn-off shotgun, was dumped in a bin bag. This was not a random attack. Investigators quickly tied the shooting to the murder of Bailey Atkinson. Samuel Danks Petty changed number plates and ensured their escape. Connor, just 20 years old, was pronounced dead at the scene. Detectives knew from the start that the killers had left a trail, and they intended to follow it piece by piece. The stolen black Ford Focus was the first breakthrough. Within minutes of the shooting, it was seen fleeing Well Lane at speed, and less than an hour later, it was found abandoned on Worley Lane. Inside, forensic teams recovered gunshot residue, fingerprints, and crucial DNA evidence. Investigators also discovered that the sawn-off shotgun used in the attack had been dumped nearby in a bin bag, still carrying traces of the brutal strike. CCTV cameras across Walsall told the rest of the story. Detectives pulled hundreds of hours of footage, tracking the Focus from its movements earlier in the day to the seconds leading up to the murder. The car was seen cruising near the van multiple times, confirming that the attack was no random drive-by, but a planned ambush. Mobile phone data was key, linking Sambrook, Selleck, Falconer, and Danks Petty together in the lead-up and aftermath of the shooting. By mid-April 2024, detectives had built a watertight case. The combined evidence of CCTV, DNA, and digital forensics left no room for doubt. The four men were arrested and charged with murder, attempted murder, and possession of a firearm with intent to endanger life. Falconer was also charged with possession of a knife after being caught with a blade during his arrest in Dudley on the 2nd of August 2023. On the 30th of May 2024, Wolverhampton Crown Court delivered its judgment on the brutal killing of Connor Brooks. Jake Sambrook, 23, of Fisher Road, Bloxwich, was identified as the driver of the stolen Ford Focus. He received a life sentence with a minimum term of 29 years. Byron Selleck, 20, of No Fixed Abode, was also sentenced to life with a minimum term of 29 years. Julian Falconer, 20, of Wiley Close, Willenhall, who was a backseat passenger and believed to have encouraged the shooting, was handed the same sentence. Life with a minimum of 29 years. Samuel Danks Petty, 21, of Buildwas Close, Walsall, who helped the killers cover their tracks by hiding the car and switching number plates, was convicted of perverting the course of justice. He was jailed for 3 years. What do you think about this case and the sentences handed down to both sets of killers? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you want more real UK crime stories told with every detail and every fact, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. There's always another case, another story, waiting to be uncovered. It started with a dog walk. It was a cold December morning when a dog walker came across something unusual near Woodland, a narrow footpath outside West Calder. At first, it looked like part of an animal, weathered bones sticking through the earth. But as police arrived and began the search, it became clear this was something else. So police sealed off the area. Forensics moved in, and what they found wasn't a full body, just fragments. A skull, part of a spine, no clothing, no personal effects, no immediate way to know who it was or what had happened. Whoever it was had been gone for months. For weeks, forensic teams worked through the evidence. And then, quietly, a name emerged. A name that hadn't been spoken in months, not since he vanished from Glasgow without a trace. Martin Hamilton, a man feared across 2 cities, linked to torture, rape, extortion, and some of the most disturbing crimes ever uncovered in Scotland's underworld. This is the story of how he built that empire, and how it ended in a shallow grave. Martin Hamilton grew up in Maryhill, northwest Glasgow, just streets from the Cranston Hill police station. But even as a child, the law was never a threat. Not to him. Other school kids knew to stay clear. If Hamilton got on the bus, the smart ones got off. They called him unpredictable, some called him sadistic, but most just called him dangerous. By the age of 17, he was already carrying weapons. In 1984, he was jailed for assault and intent to cause serious injury. He was 5'5", overweight, fast-talking, and always on edge. But people learned quickly, never mistake him for weak. He didn't run with crews, he didn't pledge loyalty. Martin Hamilton operated alone, moving in and out of Glasgow's criminal circles without allegiance. Drugs, intimidation, robbery. He touched all of it. But what set him apart wasn't ambition. It was cruelty. Hamilton had a pattern. He targeted the vulnerable, often young men trapped in addiction or debt. He used his sexuality as a weapon, raping, humiliating, and dominating. He hated being labeled, but he used fear and confusion to control his victims. And he made sure they couldn't talk. By the early 1990s, he'd survived 2 shootings outside his own home. The press gave him a name that stuck, Scotland's most hated man, and he didn't correct them. In 1992, he was jailed again, this time for a violent attempted robbery of a building society. Armed with knives and an imitation gun, Hamilton and 3 others lay in wait for staff. They didn't know the police were tipped off. The job collapsed in minutes. The courts knew who he was, but they didn't know how to stop him, because Hamilton had figured something out. If you scare your victims badly enough, you never face justice. And so far, it was working. By the late 1990s, Hamilton was wearing out his welcome in Glasgow. He'd fallen out with major underworld figures, including Arthur Thompson, one of the city's most powerful names. A botched contract killing, taken and never delivered, had burned the last bridge. So he moved east. Edinburgh's west side was nothing like Glasgow. Fewer major players and more fractured networks. Ideal for someone like Hamilton, violent, autonomous, and used to filling a vacuum. He settled into Broomhouse, Wester Hailes, and Sighthill, and then he went to work. Police in Edinburgh didn't know what they were dealing with. Their counterparts in Glasgow knew Hamilton well, but they hadn't warned them in time. What followed was a wave of violence Edinburgh hadn't seen in years. Hamilton didn't just deal drugs, he took over turf by force. He gave teenage dealers heroin and ecstasy, then demanded daily payments. When they failed, he made examples. One boy had his finger cut off. Another nearly lost an eye to a teaspoon. Reports began surfacing of young men being beaten, scolded, and sexually assaulted, sometimes both. Local pub landlords were next. One admitted paying £30,000 just to keep Hamilton away. Another tried to do business with him and ended up in a ditch, shot in the head. The police finally responded. A 24/7 surveillance unit was launched. They tracked his movements, logged his meetings, and waited for a mistake. But even then, they couldn't act. Witnesses wouldn't speak. Victims were vanishing. Hamilton's hold on the community was growing stronger by the day. In just months, he'd turned scattered supply lines into a personal empire. Not with strategy, not with diplomacy, but with fear. And yet, even with police watching, even with enemies building, Hamilton wasn't finished. He wanted more, and he was about to go too far. Hamilton thrived in the silence. Fear kept victims quiet. For years, that was enough. The police knew what he was doing. They had statements, then retractions, complaints, then silence. Again and again, the pattern held: abduction, torture, and rape. But every time it neared court, witnesses vanished or withdrew. Then came the case that broke through. A teenage couple, boyfriend and girlfriend, both 18, had come to a Glasgow flat to collect drugs. What followed was a 10-hour ordeal. They were beaten until they couldn't stand, then tied up and forced to strip. Their cheeks were pierced with a blade, then boiling water was poured over their skin. To avoid blood on the carpets, Hamilton made them stand in a bathtub. He shouted instructions while others followed them out. When the girl screamed back, he hit her and laughed. But this time, his victim survived, and more importantly, they talked. The court knew the risks. So, the trial was moved to Inverness, 200 miles from Glasgow. No media coverage, no open records. The couple was placed under one of the highest witness protection regimes ever seen in Scotland. Their testimony changed everything. Other victims, addicts, dealers, landlords began coming forward, slowly and carefully. The stories were consistent, scars in the same places, threats repeated word for word. One man said he was tortured with pliers. Another described being set on fire. A third spoke of being sodomized at knife point, then told if he talked, his family would disappear. This wasn't just enforcement, this was sadism, and it had been going on for years. But for the first time, prosecutors had enough, and eventually charges were built. Files were locked down, the courts were ready. Hamilton's empire had always relied on silence. Now it was beginning to crack. Hamilton arrived at court under heavily armed escort. The trial took place at the High Court in Inverness, deliberately chosen to avoid the risk as we discussed earlier. And this time, the jury heard everything. The trial lasted 6 weeks. For the first time, the High Court heard the wider scale of Hamilton's violence laid out as a pattern, not isolated acts. Prosecutors drew on years of hidden files and newly cooperative witnesses, many of whom had never spoken before. Statements described a methodical cycle: drugs supplied, debts enforced, and punishments carried out with terrifying consistency. What had once been whispered between addicts and dealers was now laid bare, not as rumor, but as evidence. In November 2000, he was found guilty of 11 charges, including drug dealing, abduction, assault, and torture. For other charges, including multiple sexual offenses, the jury could not agree, but it didn't matter. The weight of what stuck was enough. Lord Kingarth handed down a life sentence with a minimum of 9 years. He described Hamilton as a man who took sadistic pleasure in the infliction of pain and the inspiration of real terror. The verdict closed one chapter, but not the whole book. Hamilton was handed a life sentence with a minimum of 9 years. It was the longest term he'd faced, and the first time the courts had held him properly to account, but few believed it would end there. Behind the scenes, officers already knew what lay ahead. He wasn't a man who faded quietly. Even in a cell, Hamilton wouldn't give up control. There was relief, yes, but not celebration. Not just because of the crimes that hadn't stuck. Not just because he'd escaped justice so many times before, but because everyone watching knew the truth. Prison wouldn't be the end of Martin Hamilton. It would simply give him new walls to manipulate. At HMP Shots, he kept his distance from the main population. Not because he feared violence, but because most inmates feared him. Guards reportedly used his name as a threat: step out of line, and you'd end up in a cell next to Hamilton. He wasn't just feared for his past, he was feared for what he was still doing inside. Hamilton volunteered as a listener, a scheme where older inmates offered support to vulnerable prisoners. It was supposed to be a safeguard for those at risk of self-harm or suicide. Instead, it gave him access. Multiple accounts later described how he used those sessions to isolate young offenders. One man, who had been on suicide watch, said Hamilton raped him twice. Once inside prison, once during a coerced meeting on day release. Too traumatized to report it at the time, he came forward years later, only after learning Hamilton might face fresh charges. Others remained silent. He didn't run gangs, he didn't work up through a hierarchy. Hamilton operated alone, and inside prison, that made him harder to control. Even after conviction, even behind bars, the abuse continued. But in 2014, that reckoning never came. Because before the court could call him back, Martin Hamilton was gone. In September 2014, Martin Hamilton was released from HMP Shots. He'd served the minimum term of his life sentence and was freed on license. To the system, it was a controlled release. But to those who knew him, it was a warning sign. Conditions were strict. Any breach would return him to custody. But within months, Hamilton began slipping back into the life he was meant to leave behind. He didn't keep a low profile. He returned to familiar routines, reconnecting with underworld contacts, moving through towns west of Edinburgh, and reasserting control where he could. He was often seen around Blackburn and Harthill, small towns with fractured drug scenes and little organised resistance. Police believe he was re-establishing himself as a collector, a role that gave him leverage without drawing direct attention. One job in particular stood out. A dealer had been injured in a motorbike crash and hospitalized. Hamilton was asked to step in and manage his customer debts, essentially taking over the tick book for cocaine transactions. It should have been straightforward. Collect what was owed, pass the £40,000 to the Liverpool crew behind the supply line. But the money disappeared. Sources said Hamilton kept it. Some claimed he never intended to hand it over. Others believed he was stalling, trying to use the cash to restart his own operations. Either way, the result was the same. He crossed people with reach, money, and a reputation for making examples. Meanwhile, he began moving more openly again. There were unconfirmed sightings in Glasgow and reports of him making calls, arranging pickups, revisiting old debts. He wasn't just slipping back into crime, he was making himself visible and vulnerable. By April 2015, he'd vanished. He was due to appear at Glasgow Sheriff Court for breaching his license. He didn't show. A warrant was issued. Police launched a national appeal calling him potentially dangerous and warning the public not to approach. Crime Stoppers offered a £2,000 reward. BBC's Crime Watch aired his face. But Hamilton was already gone. No bank activity, no phone records. Not a single confirmed sighting after the 16th of April, when he was last seen around Great Western Road, Glasgow. For someone as feared as Hamilton, that wasn't a risk. It was a challenge. But this time, the threat didn't come from addicts or rivals in Scotland. It came from those above him, the ones who expected that money back. Now we are back to the very first point from where we started. On 17th December 2015, a dog walker veered off a woodland path near West Calder. Just past the B7015, close to the edge of the Five Sisters Business Park, they saw a skull, a portion of spine. Nothing else, as we discussed it earlier. It was clear this wasn't a recent death. Whoever had buried him had made sure of that. Over the following days, specialists worked the site. Pathologists confirmed the remains were human. DNA tests followed. Quietly, without a press conference or announcement, a name emerged. Martin Hamilton. He'd been missing for 8 months. Now he was back, buried in a shallow grave, hidden in the cold soil of West Lothian. Detectives didn't call it a murder, not at first. Officially, it was unexplained. But off the record, they knew. The injuries were clear. Blunt force trauma, sharp force damage to the skull, and a bullet to the head, according to intelligence sources. This wasn't random. This was an execution. There was no sign of his clothes, no trace of a struggle, just carefully chosen isolation. A location few people would stumble across, unless they knew it. Investigators began reconstructing his last known movements. He was last seen on the 16th of April 2015 around lunchtime, near Great Western Road in Glasgow. What happened after that remains unknown, but police believed he was lured out, not abducted on the street, but drawn into something he thought he could control. The main suspect emerged early, James Farrelly, 53, a Liverpudlian with known ties to West Lothian and a history of drug-related violence. He'd been living just miles from where Hamilton's remains were discovered, close enough to raise questions, but not so close as to seem careless. But it wasn't geography alone that led police to him. Investigators had received intelligence from underworld sources, whispers that Hamilton had ripped off a Liverpool-based crew for £40,000, and that Farrelly had been the one told to deal with it. Forensic searches of nearby properties, phone data, and movement records began to narrow the circle. When Farrelly's name surfaced again, links to the same drug circles Hamilton had tried to re-enter, police moved in. He was charged with Hamilton's murder, accused of shooting him, then inflicting sharp and blunt force trauma to destroy the evidence. He was also charged with attempting to defeat the ends of justice by burying the body, and with Class A drug offences tied to cocaine and heroin supply. But he never stood trial. Diagnosed with terminal cancer shortly after his arrest, Farrelly was released from custody in early 2017. He died weeks later, and with him, the last direct line of accountability. Hamilton's funeral was delayed for over 8 months while investigators worked the case. When it finally took place, only a handful attended. The man once feared in 2 cities left quietly, with no public eulogy, no headlines. No convictions followed, no final justice arrived. Martin Hamilton, the Black Hill Butcher, had spent a lifetime building power through fear. In the end, it made him untouchable, until someone decided to prove he wasn't. What do you make of this case? No trial, no conviction, just a body in the woods, and a suspect who died before he could face court. Do you think this was the only ending possible for a man like Martin Hamilton? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more real stories from the UK underworld, subscribe, turn on notifications, and we'll see you next time. There's always another case to uncover. It started with a stolen stash, gone from a house tied to one of Lincoln's biggest dealers. The loss caused chaos, and whispers began to spread that someone from inside the network had leaked the location. Sam Davies' name surfaced quickly. He wasn't an outsider. He'd worked the lines, moved product, and kept pace. But in the weeks leading up to the theft, something had changed. Then he disappeared, left Lincoln for a week. When he came back, he told people there was a hit out on him. Some thought he was paranoid, others knew better. This is the story of Sam Davies, and how a missing stash, a crumbling mind, and a crew out for revenge ended in something far more brutal. Daniel Haydari wasn't the type most expected to run a criminal network. He'd graduated from the University of Lincoln and kept a quiet profile. But by 2021, he'd built a drug supply business that moved serious weight. He was one of the biggest cannabis wholesalers in Lincoln, earning over £500,000 a year. He stayed at the top of the street-level chain and oversaw the supply. He didn't handle sales himself. That was left to people like Joe Jameson, younger, local, and well-connected. Jameson operated further down the line, but with volume. He bought one tick from Haydari, resold it to local dealers, and repaid on time. It was clean, structured, and lucrative. Jameson's crew moved fast, and one of his trusted runners was Sam Davies. At 23, Sam had drifted from university life into dealing. He wasn't violent or loud. People described him as calm, charismatic, someone who kept things moving without making noise. He wasn't in charge, but he had access. He knew the routes, the drop-offs, and everyone in the chain. For a while, it ran without problems. Haydari handled supply. Jameson kept the line moving. Sam delivered on the ground. But when money started falling behind and one of Jameson's stashes disappeared, that structure cracked, and attention turned sharply to those within. The first sign of trouble was one of Joe Jameson's safe houses had been hit, and it was clean. An estimated £8,000 worth of cannabis was taken. But it wasn't just the product that raised alarms. A laptop belonging to someone inside the network was gone too, and whatever was on it made the loss more serious than street value. Jameson was already in debt. He owed Daniel Haydari tens of thousands from previous tick deals. The stolen stash only deepened the pressure. Questions started moving fast. No forced entry, no sign of random theft. Whoever did it knew exactly where to look. 2 names came up. One was a rival dealer, known locally, with history. The other was Sam Davies. It didn't make sense at first. Sam had been part of the crew, trusted and consistent. But something had shifted. A few weeks after, there were rumors of a second theft, smaller but still connected to Sam. His behavior grew more erratic. He told friends he believed someone was watching him. He started warning people that there was a contract out on his life and was worth £20,000. Whether people believed him or not didn't matter, because the people behind that rumor were already moving. They weren't just going to ask questions, they were going to make an example. Before we move forward, let's get to the real question. Why did he make such a serious mistake by betraying his own crew? By the spring of 2021, Sam Davies wasn't the same person he'd been when he joined the network. What had started as just another route to fast money had turned into something else. Harder to manage, harder to walk away from. He was 23, with a background that didn't fit the typical narrative. He'd studied, he had plans to return to university, but somewhere along the way, the weight of the lifestyle caught up with him. Those closest to him saw the shift. His girlfriend described sudden mood swings, rising paranoia, and a growing sense of fear that wouldn't leave him. Instead of stepping back, he turned to self-medication. Not through prescriptions, but through contacts. He started buying Xanax from a rival dealer, someone known in local circles who had a reason to pull him in. The pills gave him a temporary calm, but they also made him vulnerable, easy to sway and control. That rival dealer, according to witness statements, was someone Sam began to trust more than his own crew. In the weeks before the stash house was robbed, the two were seen together more often. Therefore, the theory circulated that Davies had likely shared the location of Jameson's stash with the rival dealer he was now using for pills. The theory was simple. Sam hadn't broken in himself, but he'd made it possible. And not long after, the theft happened. And once that message spread through the network, it didn't take long for the decision to be made. Sam left Lincoln without explanation and went to Nottingham. He returned a week later. In the days before the attack, he tracked down Sam's girlfriend. Calmly, he told her if she was hiding Sam, he'd kill him. If she was lying, she'd be next. Soon after, there were rumors of a second theft that we already talked about. In response, he changed the way he moved, told his girlfriend to lie if anyone came asking for him. He stayed indoors, avoided familiar places. But by then, the damage had already been done. He hadn't just fallen out with the crew, he was now the reason they looked weak. And in their world, weakness always had a cost. In their world, to keep their hold on the lines, Daniel Haydari and Joe Jameson needed to send a message, not just to Davies, but to anyone else watching. That message came in the form of a contract. According to evidence heard in court, Haydari reached out to Billy Gill, a younger associate within the local scene. In a message, Haydari kept it short. Gill didn't hesitate and passed on a name. Imantas Gochman, a 20-year-old with a record, and someone Gill said had done that stuff before. From that point, the plan moved quickly. The target was clear. The fee was agreed. Phone records, later presented to the jury, showed an intense flurry of contact between Haydari, Jameson, Gill, and Gochman in the lead-up to the attack. Messages went back and forth throughout the afternoon and evening of 27th May. CCTV later confirmed that Gochman had changed into all-black clothing that night before leaving his house. He was captured moving through the area, heading toward Coleridge Gardens, where the attack would happen. The setup was tight, coordinated, and deliberate. On the evening of 27th May 2021, Sam Davies believed he was heading to meet someone he trusted, a friend, possibly a dealer, someone he'd met through Lincoln's drug scene. He didn't know it was a setup. At 10:30 p.m., a taxi picked him up and dropped him off near Browning Drive close to Coleridge Gardens, a quiet residential area in Lincoln's St. Giles estate. Evidence later revealed he believed he was collecting Xanax, something he'd been using regularly in the weeks before. But the person he thought he was meeting never existed. The messages, invite, and the location all orchestrated. Waiting in the shadows was Imantas Gochman. Gochman had come prepared. He wore dark clothes and was armed with a replica Rambo-style knife. At about 10:45 p.m. on May 27th, as Sam made his way through the quiet estate, Gochman approached him without warning. 2 deep knife wounds, both to the chest. The attack was fast and brutal. By the time neighbors heard movement, it was already over. CCTV footage later showed Gochman fleeing the scene. Sam didn't collapse immediately. Somehow, he stayed on his feet. Bleeding heavily, he staggered down the street and made it to a nearby house. He knocked. A resident opened the door to find him slumped and soaked in blood, struggling to speak. Emergency services were called within minutes. Paramedics attempted life-saving treatment at the scene, later taking him to the Queen's Medical Centre in Nottingham, where doctors performed open heart surgery, but the damage was too severe. At 2:45 a.m., Sam Davies was pronounced dead. Behind it, there were messages, contacts, and phones, and detectives were already beginning to pull at the threads. The crime had been silent, but the crew had left behind noise, data, footage, and digital footprints that would build the case brick by brick. It began with the knife. After the attack, police secured the scene at Coleridge Gardens. In the search that followed, officers recovered the weapon, discarded near the site. Forensic analysis confirmed Imantas Gochman's DNA on it. That was the first link, but far from the last. Next came the phone records. Detectives mapped out communications between Haydari, Jameson, Gill, and Gochman on the day of the murder. The volume and timing were crucial. Messages had flowed between them throughout 27th May, growing more frequent as evening approached. The contacts spiked in the final hours leading up to the stabbing, and then dropped immediately after. Investigators also retrieved chat logs and texts, one of them that we have already discussed, where he was asking for the killer. Then came the CCTV footage. Cameras tracked Gochman in the hours before the attack. He was seen leaving a pub, heading home, and changing into all-black clothing. Later, more footage captured him moving through the St. Giles area, walking toward the location where Sam Davies had been lured. Other footage placed vehicles linked to the defendants loitering near the scene before the attack. Finally, there was the link to the fake meetup. The person Sam thought he was meeting had used a new number, consistent with how his rival dealer named as Carlito operated. But that number, police found, was traced back to Gochman. Each piece alone wasn't enough, but together it was airtight. A discarded knife, a coded message, a fake invite. The Crown called it premeditated, coordinated, and impossible to explain away. The moment the dots connected, Lincolnshire police moved fast. The first to be picked up was Joe Jameson, aged 23. He was arrested in Lincoln and taken into custody on suspicion of murder. Jameson, who had earlier threatened Sam's girlfriend, was already known to police. But now they had evidence placing him at the center of a conspiracy. Shortly after, officers arrested Daniel Haydari, 24, also in Lincoln. Billy Gill, just 20 years old at the time, was arrested next. Police traced him to his home on Beaufort Close in Lincoln. Then came Imantas Gochman, 19, from Sturton Close, Lincoln, the man police now believed had delivered the fatal blows. He had vanished in the hours after the killing, but was arrested following a public appeal. Forensics had already tied him to the knife recovered at the scene. In total, 9 people were arrested during the investigation. Among them were a 15-year-old boy held on suspicion of assisting an offender and a 21-year-old for conspiracy to murder, but only 7 individuals were charged with murder. On the 12th of January 2022, the trial of 7 men charged with the murder of Sam Davies began at Nottingham Crown Court. The case was heard before the Honourable Mr. Justice Goss and would run for more than 13 weeks, longer than expected, due to the volume of evidence and the complexity of the conspiracy. The prosecution presented a case built on coordination and premeditation. They laid out the strong and undeniable evidence gathered by police during the investigation. Text messages, phone records, and CCTV footage were central to the Crown's case, especially the message sent by Daniel Haydari to arrange the hit. The defense attempted to challenge the meaning of the messages. They argued that the word dip was slang for robbery, not violence, and that there was no proof the intention was to kill. They also questioned Sam Davis's character, pointing to his own mental health struggles, his fallout with Jameson, and his alleged involvement in drug activity and theft, but the jury didn't accept that version. On the 6th of April 2022, the jury delivered a unanimous verdict. 4 men were found guilty of murder. The other 3 defendants, Eric Kiesel, Charlie Wakefield, and a 17-year-old boy, were acquitted of all charges. 6 days later, on the 12th of April, sentencing was handed down. Joe Jameson, aged 24, was sentenced to life imprisonment, with a minimum term of 25 years. The court found that he had played a leading role in orchestrating the attack and threatening Sam's girlfriend. Daniel Haydari, 25, also received life with a minimum of 25 years. He was identified as the senior figure in the operation, the one who funded and authorized the hit. Imantas Gochman, 20, the man who carried out the stabbing, was sentenced to life in prison, serving a minimum of 24 years. Billy Gill, 21, was handed life with a minimum of 23 years. 4 men went down for murder. But for the Davies family, no sentence could undo what was lost. What do you make of this case? Was the sentencing fair, or did someone deserve more time? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more real UK crime stories like this, subscribe, turn on notifications, and we'll see you in the next one. There's always another case to uncover. The car park was silent. The cold February air hangs heavy. A man in a high-vis jacket waited, as if part of the shadows. Within a minute, 6 sharp cracks echoing off the walls. By the time anyone reached him, the father of 3 was already on the ground. What led to that moment didn't start here. It started months earlier, with a quiet grudge and a promise that would not be forgotten. This is the story of 2 men, a single betrayal, and a promise of revenge that ended in tragedy. Lenny Scott wasn't the kind of man who made enemies easily. At 33, he was known for being a devoted father, a solid friend, and someone who took pride in his work. He lived in Prescott, balancing his job as a former prison officer with raising his 3 young children. To those around him, Lenny was the kind of man who would do anything for his family, a gentle giant, as those closest to him described him. He had a love of football, once playing for local teams like the Rainhill Rockets, and also remembered for his easy sense of humor and a natural warmth that drew people to him. His life was one of quiet determination. Friends described him as a man who always seemed to have a smile, no matter how hard things got. He was a father who found joy in the simple things, joking with friends and making time for his kids. But behind the image of a devoted father and community man, Lenny's career had brought him face to face with dangerous situations. Working at HMP Alt Course meant dealing with hardened criminals, and over time, he had earned a reputation among colleagues for being sharp and observant. It was this keen eye that would place him in the path of a dangerous chain of events, one that started with a forbidden relationship and ended with his name at the center of a murder trial. Lenny Scott could never have known that a single decision, choosing to speak out about something he believed was wrong, would put a target on his back. Before the murder, there was a betrayal, one that began inside the walls of HMP Alt Course. Elias Morgan, 35, was serving time when he became involved in an illicit relationship with a female prison officer, Sarah Williams. I'll be diving deeper into their secret affair in an upcoming video, so make sure you subscribe and turn on the bell icon to catch it when it drops. It was a secret that could have cost her career and his freedom. Hidden messages, a contraband phone, all of it was kept behind the bars of the Liverpool prison. but one man found out. Lenny Scott, then a prison officer himself, discovered Morgan's phone. Inside were messages that exposed the affair. It wasn't just evidence of rule breaking, it was leverage, something Morgan could not allow to get out. According to the prosecution, Lenny was offered £1,500 to stay quiet. Money he refused to take. That refusal marked him. Witnesses later told the court how Morgan reacted with cold anger. He told Lenny that he would bide his time and promised to get him, making a gun gesture as if sealing the threat. For Morgan, this wasn't just about the risk of exposure. It was about pride, control, and the humiliation of being outed by a guard. The tension between the two men didn't fade with time. In fact, prosecutors argue, it deepened into something darker. By the time Morgan left prison, the grudge had grown into a plan for retaliation. He wasn't just going to silence Lenny, he was going to make a statement. What began as a secret affair inside a prison would spiral into a violent feud, one that would spill out onto the streets of Skelmersdale. The events leading to Lenny Scott's death began long before the shots were fired on Peel Road. By mid-2023, links between Elias Morgan and Anthony Cleary were already under scrutiny. Cleary, 29, was not a known violent offender like Morgan, but prosecutors say he played a vital supporting role. We will talk about him in a few minutes. June 2023, just days after Morgan entered a not guilty plea over possession of the illicit phone found by Lenny Scott, he was photographed at Glastonbury Festival. Cleary was with him. Pictures recovered from Cleary's handset, later presented in court, showed the pair posing with the festival backdrop, another with Cleary's arm slung over Morgan's shoulder. It was the start of a pattern of movement and contact that prosecutors say connected them in the months leading up to the murder. July to December 2023, Morgan's Mercedes GLC became a crucial thread in the investigation. Telematics data revealed the car had been in Spain from at least July 11th until December 11th. Between November 12th and 19th, a mobile number attributed to Morgan was active on networks in both the UAE and Spain, evidence that mapped his movements across multiple countries. Cleary's role began to emerge during this time. Court evidence showed that on December 12th, phones linked to both men crossed from Spain into France. An Instagram message retrieved from Cleary's account revealed he told an associate he was with "my partner and a mate," and that they were bringing a car back from Spain with a few stops along the way. The digital trail didn't end there. Images retrieved from Cleary's handset placed them together in Paris, a quiet snapshot of a journey prosecutors argue was key to the events that followed. Prosecutors also claim he was responsible for securing the Vauxhall combo van and the electric motorbike later used in the attack. Acting on Morgan's instructions, he is said to have arranged their delivery to areas near Skelmersdale, ensuring the gunman would have both transport and a quick escape route when the plan was set into motion. By December 13, Morgan's Mercedes was back in Liverpool. In the early hours of December 23rd, Morgan made payments to Aer Lingus in Dublin and later to Manchester Airport. Cell data later showed his phone in mainland Europe between December 24th and 30th, and again in Spain between New Year's Eve and January 2nd, 2024. Prosecutors allege these trips and connections form part of the planning phase that led to the fatal confrontation with Lenny Scott. By early January 2024, the prosecution said Morgan's plan was already moving into its final phase. On January 3rd, he allegedly carried out what prosecutors have called a recce day, a reconnaissance mission to map out Lenny Scott's routines and the key locations connected to him. ANPR cameras first captured Morgan's car traveling west along Speke Boulevard at 1:47 p.m, heading towards the Mecca Gym in Speke, one of Lenny's regular spots. Between 1:49 p.m. and 1:59 p.m. CCTV tracked the same vehicle circling along Gaskill Road, close to the gym, before looping back. At 2:19 p.m., a phone attributed to Morgan connected to a cell tower on Ramsbrook Lane in Widnes, less than a 10-minute drive from the gym. Near identical movements were picked up again between 2:52 p.m. and 3:08 p.m., showing his car making another pass near the Mecca gym. Later that afternoon, the focus shifted closer to Lenny's home. At 5:57 p.m., Morgan's Ford Fiesta triggered an ANPR camera along Warrington Road in Prescott, placing him in the vicinity of Hawthorne Road, where Lenny lived. By 6:48 p.m., the same phone linked to Morgan connected to a cell site covering the area around Peel House in Skelmersdale, the gym where Lenny would ultimately be shot. CCTV presented in court showed two unidentified men approaching the entrance to Peel House between 6:56 p.m. and 7:08 p.m. before walking away. Just minutes later, Morgan's phone was recorded again, this time pinging a different cell on the far side of the motorway. By 8:06 p.m., his car was recorded heading back into Liverpool. During this time, prosecutors say Anthony Cleary was taking on a critical supporting role. He allegedly prepared the van and electric motorbike, moving them into position near the gym to give the shooter both access and a rapid escape route, as we discussed earlier. It was the final layer of planning before the fatal ambush just weeks later. February 8, 2024 began like any other day for Lenny Scott. By evening, the father of three was heading to Peel House Gym on Peel Road in Skelmersdale, unaware that someone was waiting for him. Prosecutors allege that Elias Morgan, wearing a high-visibility jacket and carrying a handgun, lay in wait near the car park. During this time, Morgan's Mercedes GLC was parked a short distance away, having arrived from Liverpool earlier that evening. Evidence from ANPR and CCTV linked the vehicle's movements to Darfield and Daybrook, locations that investigators believe were staging points for the attack. At 7:35 p.m., as Lenny left the gym and paused near his car to speak with a friend, the gunman approached. According to court evidence, Lenny's companion noticed the masked figure and recalled him saying, "Who's that guy in a mask?" moments before 6 shots rang out. The gunman fired at close range, hitting Lenny in the head and body. Emergency services were called immediately, but despite the efforts of medics and bystanders, including 2 ex-army medics who attempted first aid, Lenny's injuries were catastrophic. CCTV then captured the shooter fleeing on the electric motorbike, which was loaded into a van nearby. Lenny Scott was taken under armed escort to Aintree University Hospital, but he was pronounced dead at 10:50 p.m. The gunman had vanished back towards Liverpool, leaving behind spent 9mm casings and a devastated community. Lancashire police launched a major murder investigation within hours of the shooting. Detectives quickly cordoned off Peel Road, while forensics teams combed the car park outside Peel House Gym for evidence. Spent 9mm bullet casings were recovered, alongside CCTV footage that would become crucial in piecing together the gunman's movements. The footage showed a masked figure in black clothing wearing an orange high-visibility jacket, the same detail we've already discussed from the night of the attack. Public appeals went out almost immediately. Officers urged anyone who had seen a rider on an electric or scrambler bike, or anyone who might have captured dashcam footage, to come forward. A specific request was made for sightings of the high-vis jacket or any abandoned bikes in the area. Lancashire police increased patrols across Skelmersdale, assuring the community that incidents like this were extremely rare, but that resources were being poured into the investigation. The search quickly spread beyond Skelmersdale. Within days, a 25-year-old man from Liverpool was arrested on suspicion of murder. He was later released on bail while detectives continued to build their case. 3 other men, aged 27, 34 and 37, were also arrested across Merseyside on suspicion of offences ranging from assisting an offender to conspiracy to commit murder, each released on conditional bail as inquiries continued. As the evidence trail deepened, investigators turned their attention to Elias Morgan's Mercedes GLC. As we already discussed, this vehicle had been tracked for months through telematics and AMPR data, moving across countries, but after the murder, the car became a key forensic target. False number plates were discovered, and the search uncovered Morgan's fingerprints on both the front and rear plates. Blood with his DNA was found behind a removed control panel, linking him further to the vehicle. All of this, combined with the earlier reconnaissance timeline, cell site data, and international travel records we've already discussed, form the backbone of the prosecution's case, revealing a web of planning, movement, and calculated escape routes that prosecutors say tied both Morgan and Anthony Cleary to the attack. In the days after the shooting, Lenny Scott's family spoke of a man whose life revolved around his children, his work, and his close-knit community. Tributes poured in for the 33-year-old father of three from Prescott, remembered as a gentle giant and a devoted dad who was both strong and deeply caring. His family's statement reflected the devastation his death left behind. They described Lenny as the biggest, funniest, and most lovable person and said their lives had been torn apart. For his children, the loss was even more profound. He was their protector, their hero, the man who never failed to make them laugh. To support his family, friends organized a fundraiser that far surpassed its original target. A walk up Mount Snowdon was planned in his memory, with many taking part dressed in dog-themed onesies, a nod to Lenny's love of animals, especially dogs. The tribute was not just about raising money, but about honoring the man they knew, a man who never sought trouble, but whose life was violently cut short. At his funeral, on March 11th at Green Acres in Rainford, the family asked mourners to wear Crocs if they owned a pair, adding a personal touch that reflected Lenny's light-hearted side. The service became a celebration of his life rather than just a moment of grief. In the days and weeks following the murder, the actions of Elias Morgan and Anthony Cleary came under intense scrutiny, much of what we've already discussed. But it was what happened after the shooting that investigators say revealed attempts to cover their tracks. Morgan's movements were especially telling. Hours before his trial for the illicit prison phone was due to begin, he took a 35-mile taxi journey from Liverpool's Municipal Hotel to Preston Police Station. There, he surrendered himself, knowing that detectives were already closing in. Meanwhile, Cleary's digital footprint painted a picture of nervous awareness. Shortly after the murder, he searched Skem News Now, before accessing a police tweet about the increased presence in the area. He even looked up how to delete iPhone location history, a detail prosecutors highlighted as part of an attempted cover-up. When the trial began, the prosecution laid out this entire chain of evidence for the jury. CCTV footage, some of which we have already covered. Apart from these, the bike charger also found at Morgan's property linked him directly to the operation. All of this evidence, digital, physical, and forensic, built a web that the prosecution said left no doubt about the roles of Morgan and Cleary in the killing of Lenny Scott. The trial of Elias Morgan and Anthony Cleary is ongoing at Preston Crown Court, presided over by Mr. Justice Goose. Both men stand accused of the murder of Lenny Scott, a charge they continue to deny. Cleary also faces an additional count of manslaughter, which he has pleaded not guilty to. From the outset, prosecutor Alex Leach KC outlined the case as one driven by revenge, calling the killing a deliberate and calculated execution. The jury has been presented with the full timeline of events, along with all of the digital and forensic evidences. All of this, the prosecution argues, paints a clear picture of Morgan as the shooter and Cleary as his trusted accomplice. As proceedings continue, the jury will weigh the evidence before delivering their verdicts. No sentencing date will be set until a verdict is reached. The trial remains ongoing, with further evidence and witness testimony expected in the coming days. What do you make of this case? We'd like to hear your thoughts, but please remember, this case is still sub judice. Avoid commenting on potential sentencing or guilt. The courts are the proper forum for that. If you want to follow every twist in this case and others like it, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications. Which case should I cover next? Share your thoughts below.